Okay, so we're almost ready to start simming, but there's one more thing we need to do, and that is make some lower res proxy pieces from our high res pieces. So I just dropped down a for each loop. We're gonna iterate on our pieces here, obviously. To do that, let's unpack them like so, and we're gonna wanna transfer over the name. We don't wanna lose these names after we make low res versions of them. There we go. And then we're going to promote them immediately back up to the primitive level. They're going to come in as point level because that's where the names are stored currently on the packed pieces, as you can see, name. So we promote them up to the primitive level, name. Actually, should probably look it up here in the first place. And then there we go. So that's actually what's going to go into the for loop. And you'll see as we run over it, it's going to do quite a few. You can see it just really tears through it pretty fast. Even though there's 21,000 pieces, I mean, admittedly, it's not doing any. There's nothing in there to do yet, but it's still going to be pretty fast. So what is it going to be doing in this for loop? Well, like I said, we basically want to down res these pieces. So it's kind of a shard looking thing. As usual with these for loops, let's just do one at a time. Let's find one that is like a good representation of what we're doing. So I'm just gonna like go through here. I don't know, it doesn't really matter. So just find one maybe that has that shares the surface. So let's say, so not one that's below ground. This one's on the surface. And there you go. Basically what we're going to do in this loop is two things. One is that we're going to down res this geometry so it's more simplified, which will make for better collision hulls later on, and will also make it just easier to work around here, and we'll just swap out the high res for the small one, for the low res ones later anyway. So here we go. So here's a piece, and the main thing that we really want to do is simply a poly reduce. Poly reduce is super fast and super good. So if we put it on, keep 5% of the primitives that there already was. So there you go. So we look at this and we're like, that's not so great. So what should we do first? This is happening because with the Voronoi anyway, these walls are not actually fused together with the top surfaces. So these islands of geometry are coming apart. So let's fuse it first. There we go. So now you can see it did something, 1599 points to 1287 points. Fuse, of course, puts points that are near to each other right on top of each other and then makes them the same point. So it basically just closes little gaps and holes, which is exactly what we want. So here's a lower res representation of this. 2,000 primitives versus 128 primitives. I mean, that's great. So there you go. Looking good so far. Now, sometimes though, what can happen is you have a very small piece to begin with. Like let's say maybe I can even find one. I'll try real quick. I might be able to find a tiny little shard piece. Actually, that one might work. So here's a very small piece already. And how does he poly reduce? Actually, that is the poly reduction. Let's find an even worse piece then. Let's find, let's see, a lot of these are the pieces on the top. Let me just fly through it. This one might be good enough. So when this is on, okay, perfect. So it came in as this, which has volume. You know, it has a surface around a center. It's hollow, of course, because there's polygons. But as far as we look at it, we're like, this is a solid object. However, when we poly reduce it, it's now just one triangle. It's not a solid object anymore. It's an infinitely thin plane. We can see that here. It's apparently two triangles right on top of each other, which is still not a solid. That's bad. We don't want that. We don't want to sim that. Bullet can sim it, but it's not great. So let's put a little switch in here and say, if that happens, then do something else. In fact, what we'll do is, if that happens, we'll just keep the lowest amount possible, which is 4. This is that tetrahedra that we talked about earlier, where it's just a triangle and then a point. This is the smallest unit of volume, essentially, that you can make with polygons. If we removed any one of these polygons, it would no longer be able to be a solid volume anymore. So we just ask the switch, we say, hey, let's perform the polyreduce every time. And let's just see what it gets. Let's give it a chance. But if it returns with less than 4 primitives, then do the other thing. This is exactly what's happening now. It made only 2 primitives, so 2 is less than 4, which is true, which is 1, which means choose input 1, which says at least keep 4 primitives. So that will run on everybody's stuff. Great. So let's go back to our original piece or some other big piece. This is probably fine. No, not you. I want one again that shares the ceiling. So I'm just going to bypass this for a moment. Just put it right up to the top. So I don't want it to perform that. Let's see. Let's go to this one. So this one's on the surface, as we can see. Again, if we don't believe that, we can template the original surface there. Cool. The reason why I'm so interested in it being a surface piece is because we need to know that. In fact, we need to know that right here as soon as it comes in. Let's drop down a wrangler, a primitive wrangler, and say determine surface piece. All we want to do is we want to say, hey, is there a single primitive in here that is on the surface? And if so, set this to 1. Surface piece is equal to find attrib val. You'll remember this from previous lessons. I like this expression or this function a lot. Basically, it says look in input 0 for a primitive attribute, and the attribute's going to be surface. The one that we set before is either 0 or 1 if the primitive is a surface attribute or not. And is it ever equal to 1? If it finds 1, if it finds a primitive where it's equal to 1, it will return the primitive number of that. Otherwise, it will return -1, and that's what we are concerned with. If it never finds it, it'll return -1. So this is basically saying you are a surface piece if you can find at least one instance, one polygon that has one. The whole polygon, the whole piece is marked as a surface piece now. Actually, we'll put it in the details, so it only needs to run one time. So this, for example, if we look in the details area, is a surface piece. It's marked as 1. Whereas if we were to try something else, maybe, like this doesn't look like it's on the surface at all, I could probably look in here and find surface piece is equal to 0. So you can see it's works pretty well. So here we're back to that surface piece. Great. So we know that. So we're going to take that out of here with us, along with the cool new looking piece. And what else we want to do? We want to find out the volume again. So just like before, we drop a measure down. This will be exactly the same. Volume. We're going to want to do the centroid of, we'll just say of the switch with the result, and get the dx. That's the x component of the vector, the y component, and the z component. And make sure that that's right. We can middle click it. Center. Boom, 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 boom. Looks correct to me. We'll do the attribute promote to add them all up, to take every bit of from the primitive level, every bit of volume, put it on the detail, sum it up. And now we have that detail. So now we made 2 detail things. We made this one, which made the surface piece, and we made this one. So now actually when we do our second attribute promote, let's demote both of them. Let's demote surface piece and volume to the primitive level. And then we'll be able to come out the other side of this with that. Now, preemptively, going to put a file cache down there, which means I'm going to switch over to manual for a minute. grab, let's say this one, put it down here, connect it up. And actually, before I even run that, I'm going to say, let's then put an assemble down here. We already have the name, remember. We did that here. We promoted it up to primitive, which is what assemble wants. Assemble will push it down to being a point name attribute, but it expects to find it at the primitive level, which is kind of strange. And we want to transfer up that surface piece and volume attributes that we just made. Cool. And then after it does that, we're actually also going to want to copy over any other attributes that it originally had before we unpacked it here. So basically right here, we just want to copy them all back without even really thinking about it. At the very least, what we really need to keep is side and the start time and all that, or start frame rather. But so once again, we're going to match it by the name. Oopsies. Match it by name. Copy everything from the original pieces to the new proxy pieces. Don't match p attribute. We definitely don't want to do that because, as you'll see, coming out of the other side of this, by doing the poly reduce, we are going to change the dimensions of the piece. So it's going to shift slightly. So we don't actually want it to go back to where it used to be. We want to just keep it where it has become. So file cache initial, we'll just call it actually no more initial. We'll just say these are the proxies now. All right, that should do it. Actually, one last thing we should do is we did just recalculate the volume here. So we don't want to calculate, we don't want to have it copy the volume over here. So I'm going to say not volume, but everything else you can bring over. And that should be fine. And we go down here and we make sure that this is not on single pass anymore and save it. And you can see how fast it goes through it, which is pretty nice. Still, it's going to take a minute, so I'm going to let it stew. Okay, so it's all done. Put it back into auto update mode so it can read it out, and there it is. Looking good. If I put it into the flat wire shaded, you can see how much less resolution there is now. Significantly less, but still pretty good. Like the triangles look nice. The simulation is really gonna be able to it's gonna generate the convex hulls easier because there's less geometry it has to consider and ingest, and the convex hulls will more likely look better anyway. Some of the sharper, less important details will have been smoothed out by the reduce. Stuff that didn't matter, but that the convex hull would try to encapsulate. So we got all that now. Great. Let's take a look in here and see that we have what we expect. We've got our volume, business going on. Close enough. And now, with this knowledge, we got our surface piece information and we have our volume stuff. And once again, we're going to want to do some kind of volume test and say, are you too small? Should you even be in this sim? Doesn't matter. We have 20,000 pieces, which is doable, but it's a lot. If there's no reason to simulate them if they're so small that it doesn't even matter. We can always add in dust and particle stuff later. So I'm just going to say if the volume that we just calculated is less than some threshold, then instead of deleting it straight up, let's just actually add it to a group for now and then delete it, just so we can get a sense of what we're deleting. So group too small. Click that to make it. Let's just choose 1 by default. We'll figure it out in a minute. So it looks like a good 18,000 pieces are smaller than 1. So a fun little way that I like to do this sometimes is put the split here and we'll just use that. So there they all are. So now we get to visualize all the pieces that we're going to lose. And then by continuing the geometry stream essentially from the second input, they're deleted. But meanwhile, you get to see it first before it goes away. So, I don't know, kind of fun. You make your own fun when you're in Houdini all day. So you can see though, we went from having all these pieces to all these pieces, and it looks largely the same, But we lost a lot of pieces on the surface, and that's a problem. We can't lose pieces on the surface or else it's going to look stupid. So that whole thing that we just calculated in here, determine surface piece, that's why we did that. You get an instant pass no matter how small you are if you are a surface piece. So we'll say only run this if there is no surface piece, or if it's not a surface piece. Remember not to put spaces. Surface piece is equal to 0. So now all the surface ones come back. So instead, we're splitting out 16,000 primitives, and now we only have 5,000 left as opposed to the original 21,000. Now that said, we don't actually want to get rid of all these. Plenty of this is perfectly legitimate stuff to keep. So let's just play around with this. So 1 is that. What does 0.1 get us? Some of these pieces still look a little big to be losing to me. So let's try 0.01. So now we're back to 12,000 pieces. That's still a pretty big savings. Let's see. What if we went even crazier and said that? Now we have, yeah, so more or less the same actually at that level. And 13,000 pieces. I'm going to stick it here with 13,000 pieces. That seems fine to me. So we're still losing these little shards and weird things. They won't be missed again. We'll add in our own debris later, but we were keeping quite a bit of it. And again, especially we're keeping the stuff on the surface. So we'll just say proxies cold. Great. So that whole thing is the proxy area. And let's just put that in a cool looking box. I just clicked the wrong one now. Okay, get a cool looking color like that. Great. Wonderful.